It's now my very great privilege, really, to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr Alasdair Brooks. Again, we have a detailed biography for Dr Brooks and the abstract for his keynote address on page 28 of the program. Dr Brooks is the Chief Executive of Reform Heritage, an independent charity based in Stokeon-Trent in the UK, and of the city's Heritage Development Trust. The charity is best known for owning and operating Middleport Pottery, which we'll see a sneak preview of shortly. And Alasdair is a distinguished scholar, a great contributor to our profession and an internationally recognised expert who in his very varied career has worked on every continent except Antarctica. But for us, he is best known for his work on 19th century British ceramics in an international context and for his 2005 book on British ceramics, which was published by Asher and La Trobe University. Today, he's going to talk to us about revisiting that topic and thoughts related to preparing an updated edition of the book 20 years later. So please welcome Dr. Brooks.
All right, good morning, everybody. We'll fight through the residual jet lag here. My thanks to Paul for the welcome to country, and many thanks also to the Asher Committee for inviting me to give the keynote address this morning. My very first Asher conference in 2001 was in Canberra, so this really does feel like coming full circle, and for those of you looking for an omen, the Brisbane Lions won the grand final that year. So, back in 2001, I arrived in Australia with a brand new PhD, knowing no more than a handful of people in the entire country, ready to start a postdoc research fellowship at La Trobe University that I'd applied for with Susan Lawrence's encouragement. Hello, Susan. I think I was ostensibly supposed to be doing research on the ceramic signature of Scottish and Welsh communities in colonial Australia and comparing them to their counterparts back in the UK. But I soon became frustrated with, well, let's call them inconsistencies in how Australian ceramics assemblages had been recorded in the 1980s and 1990s. And Susan later said to me, "Oh, Alasdair, the only people who understood your postdoc research program always knew it was impossible." But we're long since past worrying about that. So instead, at the suggestion of a friend back in the UK, I set out to write an introductory guide to British ceramics in Australia in the vague and possibly slightly hubristic hope that this might help standardize analysis. Susan then kindly took the lead in arranging for Asher and La Trobe to share in publishing the book, though given the niche topic, it only had a very small print run. I've been intermittently asked over the last decade whether or not I might be interested in doing a second edition. Martin Gibbs, Penny Crook, and Mary Casey all ran the idea past me at some point or another. Then I ran into John Pragnell and Adele Zabrisca at the 2023 SHA conference in Lisbon. That led to further conversations, and when the Asher Committee asked me again earlier this year, this time more officially, it felt like the right moment, and here I am. But one of the things I've been acutely conscious of in preparing this talk is how much artifact analysis in Australia has changed since the book was published. In my abstract for this talk, I made a mention of how I might have done things differently if I was writing the book from scratch this time around. Let's tackle a thematic biggie. Just over 20 years ago, it wasn't necessarily entirely unreasonable for a foreigner with a PhD in 19th century British ceramics, but no real foundation in Australian historical archaeology, to write what became the standard reference guide to 19th century ceramics in the country. In 2024, that would likely be functionally insane as a suggestion. Australian, and more broadly, Australasian artifact analysis has been transformed out of recognition since the beginning of the century. I mean, just look at the program to this conference, with 2 full sessions dedicated to material culture studies, something almost unimaginable at my first Asher conference at ANU back in 2001. I'm not remotely suffering from the illusion that I've somehow been responsible for the tremendous growth of artifact and ceramic studies in the last 20 years. But I was lucky with my moment. When I arrived in 2001, academic colleagues like Susan, Graham Connor, Martin Gibbs, and John Pragnell were increasingly encouraging a more rigorous approach to artifacts. Companies like Casey and Lowe and GML were ensuring a more central role to artifact analysis in commercial work. Important heritage sites like Port Arthur wanted to include their archived collections in interpretation. Then PhD students like Penny Crook, Sarah Hayes, and Susan Lampard were placing artifacts front and center in their research, while colleagues like Jean Harris and Christine Williamson were setting up the framework for artifact-based consultancies. I played little role in making any of that happen, but I was lucky enough to be here at the right moment to take advantage. So one thing that's been worrying me slightly while thinking about a second edition of the book is how the hell do I approach revising the historiography chapter? 20 years ago, I could reasonably expect to summarize the majority of peer-reviewed published ceramics research up to that point in the book. In 2024, that might well take a book of its own. It probably says everything you need to know about how much things have changed, that back in 2006 or thereabouts, I was interviewed for a material culture studies job at the National Museum of Australia right here in Canberra, and was turned down on the grounds that, quote, "We can't see what an archaeologist can contribute to material culture studies," end quote. Right. But my own perspective has also inevitably developed and changed over the last 20 years. About 15 years ago, in an uncharacteristic and not entirely successful lurch into postmodernist theory, I wrote about a psychogeographic phenomenology of the self. It's a bit of a mouthful. It was also realistically just an unnecessarily fancy way of arguing for self-awareness of how the places where we grew up or had formative life experiences necessarily influence our professional outlook and worldview alongside our present geographical location. By the time I was 16, I'd already lived in England, Belgium, Scotland, the United States, and Iceland, and that background naturally inclined me to think of transcontinental links, though initially just focused on the transatlantic. Then, thanks to Susan Lawrence, I came to Australia for 2 years and stayed for 6 after marrying an Australian, and Zoe says hello to those of you who know her, incidentally. Those 6 years in Australia immeasurably enriched my research perspective. Then my own research horizons broadened further. I returned to the UK in 2007, but partly through design, partly through luck, and partly through that 2005 ceramics book gaining an unexpected and unlikely second life in the southern cone of South America, I then had opportunities to work in South America and the Persian Gulf, and the collaborations I built with colleagues in places like Venezuela, Argentina, Chile, Paraguay, Dubai, Abu Dhabi, Qatar, Oman, and elsewhere have further informed my global perspective. There was also the surreal 18 months I spent in Cairo immediately pre-pandemic helping to set up the new Grand Egyptian Museum next to the pyramids, though since that didn't involve 19th century British ceramics, we can gloss over that one. And now I'm the chief executive of Reform Heritage, Stoke-on-Trent's Heritage Development Trust, leading a charity of responsibility for regenerating Stokes-built heritage, and which owns the only continuously operating 19th century ceramics factory in Staffordshire. Also the last factory making transfer printed ceramics using traditional methods. At least 4 people in this room have been there, incidentally, and Australia and New Zealand together make up 4% of our annual visitor base, so you're all welcome if you find yourselves in Staffordshire in the future. The career paradox is that I had to work around the world before I could find myself back in the UK in a role that so neatly matches my professional background. So I want to stress that what I'm outlining this morning isn't intended to be some sort of definitive overview of 19th century ceramics analysis in or relevant to Australia. Too much has happened over the last 20 years to make that feasible, and I'm not nearly as self-confidently narcissistic as I was 20 years ago anyway. The work I'm going to outline in the second half of this talk is only a very partial and personal view from someone who's very much approaching Australia these days from the outside looking in, and whose background naturally inclines him to take a global view. Let's get a bit postmodern again. I don't think my view is in any way better than a more Australia-centric perspective. It's simply a viewpoint naturally informed by my background. Within that context, here are some discussion points that I hope to discuss with colleagues over the 3 weeks I'm in Australia to help inform a second edition of the 2005 book. Given the significant growth in Australian artifacts and ceramics analysis over the last 20 years, I need a much better feel for what colleagues here in Australia think have been the most significant developments in that time period, rather than relying on my own judgment. Last time around, I only danced around the edges of the differences between the states and territories. What do we know about differences and similarities within the archaeological record today? Where do all of you see Australian ceramics analysis resting in comparison to other parts of the world, whether in terms of research agendas or within the archaeological record? And 20 years ago, I focused solely on Australia. Is it worth being ambitious and folding in New Zealand this time around? In which case, assume the preceding questions also apply just as much to the other side of the Tasman Sea. And apologies, incidentally, to New Zealanders. If I focus on Australia, it's because of three factors. It's the context I was more familiar with. I didn't want to make the mistake of assuming that New Zealand is the same as Australia, and most embarrassingly, 19th century primary sources back in Staffordshire usually ignore you in favor of Australia, making it much easier to track the latter, for which I can only offer a retrospective apology on behalf of my home country. And I'm also conscious that there are likely things I managed to get wrong 20 years ago. In fact, I know there are. I'm only human. Like all of us, I'd like to focus on moving forward positively rather than looking backwards negatively. But if you do think I made mistakes last time around, by all means point them out to me. Though try to be reasonably gentle, please. Anyway, that was all rather long-winded background. Let's move on to placing Australia within that global context. Given the audience, I know that some of this is going to be old hat for many of you, but I also hope that there's enough new content here to ensure there's at least something for everyone. I'm going to start by offering a quick global tour of 19th century British pottery distributions with a focus on issues relating to consumption rather than production. The focus is very much on Staffordshire ceramics, but the nature of 19th century British ceramics industry means I occasionally have to be a bit more wide-ranging, and there'll be a very brief detour to Scotland. I want to stress four key themes here. The truly global scale of the 19th century Staffordshire and British ceramics trade, the extent to which the study of Staffordshire ceramics is itself global, what I refer to as the interconnectedness of things, that individual regions are often connected in surprising and illuminating ways in a global world, and finally, implicitly threaded between the different subsections, some consideration of Australia's place within that global world. Before we get stuck in, I want to show you a couple of pie charts to help outline the nature of the global British pottery trade in the 19th century. I don't want to get too bogged down in details, I just want to introduce some initial important quick facts and figures, and starting off by noting there are two ways of measuring the scale of the Staffordshire ceramics trade. The first is by volume. Many of you will recognize that this slide is lifted directly from the 2005 ceramics book, but it shows the market share of Liverpool exports of Staffordshire pottery as a percentage of volume in the last 6 months of 1860, as collated from the Staffordshire Advertiser. Australia is that little brown 1.1% at the very top. The United States may be a little bit hard to read, but is by far the largest at 57.5% of the total. The second highest category is the Brazils and South America at 10.7%, though if you throw in the 5 and a bit from Western South America, and about 16% are going to South America, making it easily the second largest export market. And in case you're desperately wondering about the specifics of total volume here, and why would you not be? These are percentages of the 69,847.5 crates shipped down the Trent and Mersey Canal and then out of Liverpool. So just over 40,000 crates to the United States, about 7,500 to the Brazils and South America, roughly 3,500 to Western South America, and 800 crates to Australia. The second way is calculating exports by value. This chart is newer, newish anyway. It's taken from data in Josiah C. Wedgwood's History of the Staffordshire Potteries and shows the market share of total exports of Staffordshire pottery as a percentage of value in 1911. Now, in this case, Australia is the third largest category in grey at 10.2%. The US is still the largest, but here only 14.1%. In terms of total value, Liverpool exports for 1911 were slightly over £3 million, roughly £250 million or 500 million Australian dollars in today's money, of which almost 2/3 were refined white earthenwares. For reference, 4 years earlier in 1907, the value of exported refined white earthenwares was almost equal to the British domestic trade of the same ware types. The big difference between the home and foreign markets in 1907 was with porcelain, where over 80% of the total value was produced for the domestic market, not the export market. While I'm sure the specifics fluctuate over time, this helps emphasize the dominance of earthenwares both in the export trade and this talk. Now, let's acknowledge that I'm not exactly comparing like with like here. The two charts are 50 years apart, 1861 and 1911. They also compare total exports with Liverpool exports and don't divide regions up in quite the same way. But they do help outline three important points. First, the truly global nature of the Staffordshire ceramics trade. Secondly, that allowing for the 50-year gap, low volume trade can be high value and vice versa, something particularly important for Australia. Now, I know that the population of Australia quadrupled between 1860 and 1911 from a bit over 1 million to 4.5 million, but that does also mean that population growth alone can't explain how you get from 1.1% of volume in 1860 to 10.2% of value in 1911. So value is not inherently tied to volume, and the value of Australian trade is relatively more significant than the volume thereof. And third, it does also help to emphasize the relative importance of South America in that global market. So Argentina is in yellow and Brazil is in green, and you combine those together and you get 16% of value, which is higher than even for the United States. And it's worth remembering that South America in this period, unlike modern stereotypes, was a very wealthy market. So Argentina, Valparaiso in Chile, even Asunción in Paraguay before the devastating War of the Triple Alliance were very high value markets for British trade. I want you to keep those trade figures in mind as I move on to a brief and by necessity somewhat skeletal overview of our global state of knowledge for archaeology of 19th century British ceramics, looking at both what we know and what we still don't know. I'm going to do this on a continent by continent basis, starting with the continents where we know the most and gradually moving on to the continents where we know the least, though inevitably I can only touch on a few key highlights here. We'll begin our whistle-stop tour of North America, the continent responsible for the largest body of published work on 19th century British ceramics, from detailed fine-grained analytical studies of Canadian and American collections through to internationally influential methodological studies. The catch is, as I've argued elsewhere, much of that work tends to implicitly consider British ceramics as a de facto form of North American material culture, rather than consider it as a cultural product of its home environment. But we'll forgive our North American cousins here for the simple reason that, as we've seen, the United States was the single largest export market for Staffordshire ceramics for much of the 19th century, often the destination for more than half of Liverpool pottery exports, the periods of the Napoleonic Wars and the US Civil War perhaps excepted. Throw in Canada, and in the first 6 months of 1860 alone, just under 2/3 of Liverpool exports were directed towards North America. Such was the importance of the North American export market, particularly the United States market, that it had a unique ability to influence Staffordshire production and exports based on its own internal preferences. For example, by the second half of the 19th century, the United States has a clear preference for white granite on plates, and this was being manufactured in large quantities specifically for export to the US. The flow blue transfer print technique is also traditionally held to have been made for the North American market, though it's relatively common in the rest of the world, and I think that needs to be reassessed. But here lies a potential problem. The North American market's importance and ability to influence British production and trade for internal consumption means that the American ceramic signature becomes increasingly distinctive and arguably unique from a global viewpoint as the 19th century progresses. Without meaning to diminish their importance within North America, interpretations of North American assemblages therefore often have limited applicability in the rest of the world, given the unique nature of the 19th century North American ceramic signature. After North America, right here in Australasia is likely the region where the most detailed relevant work has been undertaken, though perhaps I'm reflecting my own biases. From a historiographical perspective, I'd argue that two principles are at work in encouraging the growth of ceramic studies in this part of the world. Firstly, without meaning to downplay earlier contacts, permanent European colonial settlement of the region only begins with the First Fleet's arrival in 1788. after mass production of refined white-bodied earthenwares has already started to transform the production and consumption of Staffordshire ceramics. So these ceramics have always formed a key component of Australasian historical archaeology. Secondly, close colonial and cultural links existed between Britain, Australia, and New Zealand in this period, leading to a certain level of shared cultural preferences. And because of these links, Australasian historical archaeologists are much better than their US counterparts in recognizing British ceramics as British material culture, though within a British colonial context. Australia and New Zealand were never important export markets by volume, only ranging between 1% to 3% of Liverpool exports, even after the gold rushes made the new colonies fantastically wealthy in the 1850s. However, Australasian data is potentially disproportionately important to British analysis of 19th century assemblages. Of all the key international export markets, Australasia is the one where domestic consumption most closely resembles consumption in England. And here I use England rather than Great Britain with intent. This is particularly true of the shared Anglo-Australian preference for transfer-printed vessels from circa 1840 through to the end of the century. Comparisons between English and Australasian data therefore have much to tell us about subtle shifts in consumption between the metropolis and colonial markets, as well as the role of a British identity within settler colonial communities. And forgive me for skipping specific examples, many of which will be familiar to you anyway in the interest of time. Now we can turn attention towards Britain and the rest of Europe. It's one of the ironies of the global analysis of 19th century British ceramics that while we know a great deal about production in the UK, we know far, far less about domestic consumption, especially outside urban centres like London and Cambridge. As I've argued before, this incomplete understanding of consumption in the country where the ceramics were made undermines what should be a key comparative component for understanding consumption in regions where British ceramics were imported and consumed. We also need a much better understanding of regional variation within the 19th century United Kingdom, including Ireland. It could well be that a study of cut-sponged vessels would be particularly rewarding here. These seem to be an important component of assemblages in parts of Scotland, Wales, and Ireland, but also in South America, South Africa, and the Indian Ocean Rim. The connection here is clearly not predominantly cultural. Economic factors are likely important, given that cut-sponge vessels were less expensive than, for example, transfer prints. Moving on, continental Europe is also tantalizing. We know from the documentary record that vast quantities of British ceramics were exported to the continent in the period after Wedgwood perfected creamware in about 1760. We also know that Wedgwood and others deliberately targeted the continental market, and contemporary British travelers regularly described coming across British refined white-bodied earthenwares in cities from Amsterdam to St. Petersburg. Important work here has also been done by Russell Palmer and Tanya Casemiro on local 19th century industries in southern Europe that deliberately imitated British production, as well as the influence of British exports on that local production. What we don't know is what this means for everyday consumption outside cities, in part because the archaeology of the 19th century has never been a core focus in most of continental Europe. We have occasional tantalizing individual glimpses from places like Finland, Portugal, Poland, Mediterranean ports, the Basque Country, and some major urban centers, but lack a holistic picture for Europe as a whole. As a result, we also lack information on the impact of regional variation and regional preferences on consumption, whether the initial late 18th century market penetration was a metropolitan phenomenon or also reached non-urban contexts, and, crucially, the true impact of the Napoleonic Wars and the Napoleonic continental embargo on British imports. As such, it's far too early to talk of a European ceramic signature for British goods in this period, or to speculate on the extent to which Europe needs to be broken down into subsidiary geographical units for the purposes of comparative study. Moving onwards, South America, the second largest export market for 19th century British ceramics, offers exciting potential for global comparative studies of 19th century British ceramics. Indeed, for a brief period in the 1860s, when the American market was disrupted by the US Civil War, Brazil and Argentina together briefly overtake the United States as Britain's largest ceramics export market. This offers us the ability to look at issues of globalization related to informal economic colonialism rather than formal territorial control. Britain was the dominant economic power in much of South America for the period between independence in the 1820s and the First World War. This is all reflected by a rich archaeological record of British ceramics for the period, though it's an uneven one, with the most work having taken place in Argentina, Chile, and parts of Brazil. While there are large parts of the continent where our knowledge is incomplete, we do have a growing picture of continental and regional consumption. First of all, the South American wars of independence in the second and third decades of the 19th century are key to understanding the arrival of British ceramics. Prior to independence, the Spanish colonial trade monopoly restricted the import of British goods, though with regional variation. For example, while the arrival of British ceramics in Venezuela, I almost said Australia, the first time anybody has ever mixed up Venezuela and Australia in a keynote address, while the arrival of British ceramics in Venezuela only seems to date to the functional achievement of independence in the early 1820s, the status of Buenos Aires as a major center of contraband trade leads to significant consumption, at least among the local elite, from the last decade or so of the 18th century. The question of regional variation among decorative technique distribution and variation over time is something we're still coming to grips with. But with those important qualifiers in place, transfer printing, painted, and industrial slip decorations seem to be the most common decorative techniques across the continent. Exciting work has also been done on considering the changing meaning of British goods in a South American context, with Daniel Chavelson, for example, positing a connection between the popularity of blue transfer prints and the pale blue used in the Argentinian flag. In retrospect, I should have used a transfer print there of a paler blue, but never mind. And more recently on red transfer prints as a political marker. I consider it to be something of a shame that language barriers have often prevented English-speaking colleagues from fully appreciating the significance of South American work. Now, Africa is a continent with a rich variety of indigenous cultures that were impacted by multiple European colonial powers in the period under consideration here. Attempting generalizations is therefore fraught, but I've previously hypothesized 3 broad trade and consumption zones for the archaeology of British ceramics in Africa. The first is West and South Africa, considered as a single export zone by Staffordshire potters. Work undertaken by Mallon, Close, and others in South Africa has established a 19th century ceramic signature for the Cape. There are some transfer prints, but also strong components of painted wares. Data produced as a consequence of the West African slave trade suggests similarities between South and West Africa in keeping with the shared export zone, though more work needs to be done here. I say that a lot. From the global perspective, this South African signature looks remarkably like the ceramic signature for much of South America, suggesting that the Southern Atlantic should be considered as a single export zone for much of this period. The second archaeological zone is East Africa. While our data here are very partial, I've been able to use Sarah Croucher's work to show strong affinities between Zanzibar and the Persian Gulf, particularly with cut, sponged, and painted decorations. Our understanding here is in its infancy, but we may need to consider the Indian Ocean as a coherent trade unit for 19th century British ceramics. The fourth archaeological zone, which is a cheat, is all of the rest of Africa, and this is simply down to a lack of data. One issue that I would be interested in navigating here, should sufficient data eventually become available, is the extent to which trade and consumption of British and other European ceramics was primarily coastal prior to the post-1881 European scramble for Africa, or whether ordinary household mass-produced goods such as ceramics were traded into the interior in advance of formal colonialism. It's a bit of a paradox that the continent we know the least about for this subject is also the largest continent. Isolated studies of 19th century British ceramics exist for some parts of Asia, notably the Persian Gulf region and some colonial centers such as Singapore. But for the most part, Asia is a blank canvas despite the extensive impact of British and European territorial and economic colonialism during this time period. Our knowledge is likely most developed in the Persian Gulf, where work in the Gulf states has allowed us to build a preliminary picture of what are locally called late Islamic trade ceramics. Curiously, despite the close connection between 19th century European Gulf trade and British India, this is one part of the world where Staffordshire ceramics don't dominate. Instead, Dutch whitewares are the most common component within the European ceramics here. These copy Staffordshire forms and decorative techniques, again emphasizing the extent of Staffordshire's influence, but not necessarily in specific decorative motifs. Javanese language makers' marks on these Dutch ceramics, which match examples found by Croucher in East Africa and Bloch in the former Dutch colony of Suriname in South America, which had a substantial population of Javanese laborers, indicate that they're a byproduct of trade to the former Dutch East Indies, or today's Indonesia. It would be misleading for me to suggest that either the British or Dutch materials from the Gulf are in any way extensive, but they point to the extent that even then marginal markets were tied into broader European trade networks. And if you really want to bend your globalization mind, I've come across examples in the Persian Gulf of Japanese painted porcelains that directly imitate the Javanese language Dutch ceramics that themselves directly imitated Staffordshire ceramics. So the influences were flowing in multiple directions. But much of Asia remains a blank canvas for those of us interested in the 19th century material record of everyday consumption. There are any number of reasons why India, China, and other Asian jurisdictions have little interest in unearthing, metaphorically or physically, the archaeological evidence of 19th century European territorial and economic colonialism. But this does leave us with an important gap in our knowledge base. India, China, and other jurisdictions had important ceramic industries of their own, of course. But in 1860, 5.5% of Liverpool ceramics exports went to what the Staffordshire Advertiser defined as the East Indies and China, which may be only a tenth of exports to the United States, but is precisely 5 times the volume of exports to Australia. By 1911, India is the 5th largest market in terms of value of exports at 7.7%, less than Australia in terms of value, but sandwiched between Brazil and Argentina. Who are these exports going to? Western expats or local population groups? If the latter, then to what extent does this reflect conscious engagement with European material culture and European colonialism? We shouldn't make assumptions here. We know that the Glasgow-based J&MP Bell firm was specifically producing polychrome transfer-printed ceramic patterns designed for exports to Southeast Asia with a view to local consumption. Asia is still a frontier for this type of analysis, and one which will likely reward future study. Anyway, that global survey was, as noted, necessarily skeletal. I would now like to expand on that by drawing some comparisons and contrasts between the various continents before ending with a specific case study. Some years back, Susan Lawrence hypothesized, acknowledging I'm oversimplifying things somewhat for the sake of an overview, that there was a distinction between the British Empire, which preferred brightly colored ceramics such as transfer prints, cut sponge, and industrial slip, and the United States, preferring plain ceramics, notably white granite. Susan's dichotomy was an important step, but 2 key points have inspired me to broaden and adjust this somewhat. First of all, there are important consumer markets outside of the British Empire and the United States, notably South America, and we could perhaps consider potential variation within the British Empire. Australia isn't South Africa, which isn't India, which isn't Kenya, which isn't Canada. A combination of my own work in South America and the Persian Gulf and published work by a range of colleagues has allowed me to build on Susan's dichotomy to offer a broader, if still inevitably tentative picture of global consumption patterns. Many of you here this morning will already be aware that there are clear decorative affinities between urban English, and I specifically mean English, and Australian 19th century ceramics assemblages. Transfer prints frequently dominate both. However, when we compare the UK and Australia to the United States, the distinguishing feature is not bright colors versus undecorated white granite wares, which only come to dominate British exports to the United States comparatively late. Variation between Britain and Australia on the one hand and the United States on the other is both time and form dependent. South Africa and South America are more complicated. Brightly colored decorations dominate Cape Province assemblages in South Africa, but the percentage of transfer prints within assemblages seems to be subject to considerable variation. Furthermore, even assemblages where transfer prints were common seem to contain smaller quantities thereof than is the case with many English urban and Australian sites. The painted and industrial slip vessels that are found in significant quantities at the Cape are also similar to those recovered in large quantities in parts of South America, like these painted vessels recovered from Venezuela. While there's variation in specific distributions between all of these regions, color alone is therefore not a distinguishing feature of 19th century British Empire assemblages. And significantly, it's only really from the 1850s that the United States moves towards white granite and away from consuming the mixture of transfer printed, painted, and industrial slip vessels that it previously shared, though in varying quantities, with other regions. Therefore, it's only really after the 1840s that American preferences can be held to fully diverge from the British Empire and South America, something which becomes more acute after the American Civil War in the 1860s. So while Britain and Australia seem to have a shared affinity for transfer prints across most of the 19th century, the consumption of other types of colored decoration in other regions varies depending on date, whether before or after the US Civil War, and vessel form, whether the decorations are on plates versus bowls and teawares. More recently, and I touched on this in the global survey, my work in the Persian Gulf suggests it might be rewarding to look at the Indian Ocean as a shared consumption zone. While brightly colored wares are prominent here, as noted earlier, Dutch ceramics dominate in the Gulf and parts of East Africa, comprising up to 75% of some of these assemblages. This gives us, and I stress the very tentative nature of this work, 4 broad consumption regions with distinct characteristics. Britain and Australia. There's some regional variation, particularly within the UK, but transfer prints dominate in urban settings. The urban there allows for the likelihood of regional variation, still poorly understood, but apparent in initial work undertaken in Wales, parts of Scotland, and more recently in Ireland. Then South America and Southern Africa. Brightly colored ceramics are prominent throughout, but there's greater variation within assemblages than is typical for urban Britain and Australia. The United States, which becomes increasingly distinct over the course of the 19th century and is a uniquely distinct market from the 1840s or 1850s onwards. The Indian Ocean, brightly colored ceramics with a much greater presence of Dutch wares. More work needs to be undertaken on the differences between the core and peripheral markets, such as India and the Dutch East Indies versus East Africa and the Gulf. I freely concede there's been a lot of hedging of bets with tentative language there, and the more I've worked on this over the last 10 years, the more worried I am about the risk of broad generalizations masking regional variation, but at least provides a structure for understanding similarities and differences between different global markets, which we can test and develop as our knowledge expands. I want to close the substantive part of my talk this morning with a case study that helps explore 2 points. Firstly, I hope it will help outline what I call the interconnectedness of things, that looking at both the local scale and the broader global scale as an integrated whole can often reveal surprising and fascinating data about 19th century British ceramics consumption. Secondly, I hope it shows how taking a global perspective has helped me recontextualize some of the research that originally informed my 2005 book. Some of you may remember that the 2005 book contains a study on the impact of the American Civil War on Australia's ceramics signature. Specifically, I hypothesized that the presence of significant quantities of white granite from the 1860s in Australian assemblages, or at least assemblages in Victoria, was tied to British merchants attempting to offload American market ceramics in other export markets following the collapse of the important US market in the first years of the conflict. And the raw impact of that collapse can be seen in the graph, where you can see some selected 6-month periods from 1856 to 1861, and then note the difference between the final 6 months of 1860 and the final 6 months of 1861, with that yellow bar representing the United States and the extent to which that collapses. Now, I have a sneaking suspicion that the benefit of 20 years additional Australian research and a consequent greater awareness of the role in white granite in Australian assemblages may suggest that I oversimplified matters somewhat in the original book. But for the sake of argument, let's assume that the presence of white granite in at least some Australian assemblages remains tied to the impact of the US Civil War on the global ceramics trade. I'm going to ask you to hold that thought as we unexpectedly skip over to Chile, where I've recently been fortunate enough to have been involved at the kind invitation of Chilean colleague Diego Carabias in the Millennium Nucleus Project on Ocean, Heritage, and Culture. It's designed to look at Chile's maritime heritage across time, and it just so happens that 19th century British ceramics have a major part to play in showing how Chile integrated with world markets during and after its protracted War of Independence against Spain from 1810 to 1826. I'll note that the links between Chile and the 19th century United Kingdom were strong. The country's first leader, the magnificently named Bernardo O'Higgins, was the son of a Catholic Irish exile, and while that may have made Bernardo's feelings towards the UK somewhat ambiguous, he spent a significant period in London in the 1790s meeting other leaders of the emerging South American independence movement. The country's navy was founded by Thomas Cochrane, the 10th Earl of Dundonald, who separately played a significant role in the Napoleonic Wars, and whose tomb in Westminster Abbey is the site of an annual commemoration by the Chilean Navy. British merchants were an important community in the country's main port of Valparaiso, which, unusually in a South American city, prefers tea over coffee, and where onces, or elevenses, is a daily ritual for many. And that community also set up a British arch in the city in 1910. In any case, this is a country with which Britain enjoyed strong commercial links in this time period, and over 5% of the British export trade in ceramics was being directed towards West and South America in the 1860s, significantly higher than the 1.1% exported to Australia. Prior to the opening of the Panama Canal in 1914, Valparaiso was a key global port, not just as Chile's main port, but as one of the key stopping points of maritime trade between Europe and California. It was also an important link in the emerging trans-Pacific trade, and while a single individual isn't really a reliable data point, I think it's symbolic here that Chris Watson, Australia's first Labour Prime Minister, was born in Valparaiso in 1867, before moving on to New Zealand in 1868, and then on to Sydney in 1886. I was invited to Valparaiso back in 2023 to look at two collections of 19th century British ceramics recovered from the harbour, and which help us to understand the global trade in those ceramics. The collection I want to focus on here was recovered from the Chilean naval vessel, the Indefatigable. The ship sank in Valparaiso harbour in 1855, giving us a very tight date for the objects recovered. Almost all of the ceramics recovered from the vessel were British refined white-bodied earthenwares and porcelains. By far, the largest component consists of transfer-printed earthenware, but white granite, flow blue, both painted and transfer-printed, undecorated porcelain, and some other types also occur. I've provided a quick synopsis for our colleagues in Chile of why I think the Indefatigable assemblage is important, just quickly running through some of the main points. It strengthens our understanding of the 19th century ceramics trade between the United Kingdom and West and South America, where we haven't previously had many data points. It shows the range and type of transfer printed patterns that were available in Valparaiso, and some of these patterns have South American, Spanish, or contemporary US designs that seem to have been made for the South American trade. It shows the range of manufacturers whose goods appear in West and South America. It demonstrates that at least one Valparaiso merchant was engaging directly with Staffordshire potters. Their transfer-printed merchant marks appear on the reverse of some vessels. And finally, it potentially shows the British influence on the early Chilean Navy. It's not just Thomas Cochrane who's important here. Many of the crew of these early vessels were British and Irish, and they may well have influenced consumption. But for the purposes of today's discussion, and with a view to my 2005 ceramics book, I want to focus on the white granite vessels from the site. I want to stress again that this is a 19th century ceramic type that was made in Staffordshire for the North American market. Back in 2005, my hypothesis focused on a link between the presence of white granite in Australia and the US Civil War. But the examples from the Indefatigable can't be associated with the US Civil War for the simple reason that the ship sank in 1855 and the war began in 1861. I briefly touched upon Valparaiso's status as the main port on the west coast of South America for the trade between Europe and California. Those of you who work on gold rush sites in Australia will remember that the California gold rush dates from 1848 to 1855, the period immediately before the sinking of the Indefatigable. We also have records from gold rush era California stating that the newly fashionable white granite wares were popular, and this has been confirmed by archaeology. It shows these materials, only really introduced from 1845, being owned by new settlers. This led us to conclude that the occurrence of white granite in Chile is closely connected to demand in Gold Rush, California. All of which is no doubt interesting, but this is supposed to be a talk about British ceramics in Australia, at least to some extent, and not in Chile. So let's cross the Pacific again. When I first identified the connection between white granite in Australia and the US Civil War more than 20 years ago, on some level I implicitly assumed that this would be a recurring global phenomenon, that the collapse in the US export market in 1861 would lead to similar, if not necessarily identical, white granite distributions in other major export markets. But in fact, that's not the case. Conceding that this would be 2 lifetimes' work if I took it on, and even my background can't give me a comprehensive overview of every export market for British ceramics. The more research I've undertaken, the more unique the Australian white granite signature has seemed to be. I might well have expected Chile to have points of similarity of Australia, 2 southern hemisphere nations with strong, if by no means identical, British connections that were both identified export markets for British ceramics and where white granite is an identifiable element in 19th century ceramics assemblages. And yet the catalysts for white granite's presence, while both arising from historical events in the United States, are very different. In Chile, the primary cause seems to be the California gold rush. In Australia, the primary cause seems to be the US Civil War. And the Australian context increasingly seems to be unusual, potentially unique. I can't tell you precisely why Australian white granite distributions are distinct. Perhaps British potters shipped white granite to Australia in the 1860s because of a perception of shared culture. Perhaps it was the perception that Australia was a wealthy export market. We've seen that distinction between volume and value in trade. Perhaps Berlin swirl white granite is more visible in at least some Australian assemblages because a comparatively small dumping episode will be more visible in a relatively small export market like Australia. Perhaps all of these things are simultaneously true. But I do know that it took a global comparative context and South American data to fully appreciate that the Australian context for white granite was far more unusual than I had assumed 20 years ago. I'll acknowledge that noting the potential relevance of South American data to Australian material culture analysis isn't a wholly original thought, and I regret that time constraints stop me from making better use of Pamela Riccardi's valuable comparisons of material culture in Melbourne and Buenos Aires. But I hope this one, no doubt imperfect example, helps to show how I've been able to use data from one part of the world to enrich my understanding of ceramics in other parts of the world, within a global framework that attempts to understand similarities and differences in trade and consumption between regions. Australia may no longer be my core focus, but Australian ceramics data played a crucial role in building the foundations I've used for that work. At the risk of being abrupt, I'll leave it there. I'm conscious that I've likely gone on for quite a while, and I look forward in the coming days to be able to have conversations with many of you that I hope will help to inform a revision of the 2005 ceramics book for a second edition, aiming to simultaneously leave it firmly grounded in Australia, but also relevant to a more global framework. Thank you. I think I'm supposed to make myself available for questions, Siobhan, aren't I? Yes. So I am happy to take questions, comments, anything from around the room. Susan, yes. Oh, sorry, was Mary first? Sorry.
Just a quick question about the Liverpool shipping. Does that include, what percentage of ceramics leaving Britain would that include? Does it include Stoke-on-Trent or?
Well, the Liverpool figures are specifically for Stoke-on-Trent exports because the only other ceramics industry that is significant enough to show up extensively in the archaeological record for that time period is the Glaswegian ceramics industry, which is exported directly from Glasgow. The reason I'm hedging my bets slightly in terms of Liverpool versus total exports of ceramics is that a small quantity went in the opposite direction down the Trent and Mersey Canal towards Hull, towards Europe. We've seen that we're still gaining an appreciation of the European export market, and I don't yet know the extent of that export trade via Hull to continental Europe. We do know that the overwhelming majority of Staffordshire and Stoke-on-Trent exports went via Liverpool. It's by far the closer distance. We do know that a lot of the European trade went out of Liverpool, and it is the overwhelming majority of the total British ceramics trade as well, with the exception of some of the exports going from Glasgow and Scotland.
Thanks, Alasdair. That was a terrific talk, and it's great to see you back in Australia again.
Thank you.
Really interesting to see all of that global comparison that you've been able to build on in the last 20 years. Also very interesting that 20 years later, the rest of the world has really kicked on with this stuff, or at least done some research. We still don't know any more about the UK than we did when you and I had our very first conversation. What is going on, and do you see any prospect of it changing?
Oh God, this could take hours. Trying to make it as succinct as possible. Part of the reason why historical archaeology and the analysis of 19th century ceramics is more advanced in North America and Australasia is you have the sharper division between historical archaeology and prehistory. Whereas in the United Kingdom, the commercial imperatives and frequently the funding imperatives towards archaeology will require an excavation to pay far more attention to the earlier periods than it does to the post-medieval period. And even where the post-medieval period is gaining consideration, it will frequently stop with the advent of industrialization. Now, many of you in this room will know that there are, when I call them honorable exceptions, I'm really undervaluing their contributions. But people like Nigel Jeffreys at Molar in London, Craig Sesford in Cambridge, there are some colleagues in Scotland who I'm embarrassed to say their names have escaped me while I'm standing here at the podium. But there are people who are undertaking an analysis. And then David Barker in Stoke-on-Trent has undertaken extensive work on the archaeology of the production of 19th century ceramics. Although even in Stoke-on-Trent, since David retired, that has increasingly fallen by the wayside, because if you were to stop a development project in Stoke, every time you came across a large pile of ceramics, nothing would ever get done in the city. So it's only really the most historically significant, like Wedgwood or Spode sites, that ever gain any attention. Essentially, you need to convince commercial archaeologists in the UK and the funding bodies that this is valuable data. And how do we do that? I don't know. I don't have an answer for that. I mean, Nigel has undertaken extraordinary work and is increasingly himself involved in international work as well. He's just about to start a project collaborating with a colleague in Durham in the Persian Gulf. But trying to gain that data outside of London, Cambridge, to a lesser extent Leicester, and to some extent Glasgow and Edinburgh has become very difficult, and especially as government funding is increasingly cut back. And the new, in my professional role, I am rigorously apolitical, and I will work with anybody of any political background. You understand this digression in a second. Sorry, this is a very long answer as well. But I have to work with people of every political party. So in my professional, I'm usually hiding my political opinions. And as I said to my Glaswegian mother, if Nicola Sturgeon, the then First Minister of Scotland, had appeared in Stoke-on-Trent to announce the annexation of Stoke to Scotland, I would have at least allowed her to make the announcement at Middleport Pottery. And I hosted one of Boris Johnson's very last cabinet meetings at Middleport, which was a exciting day. The point is that government funding has been cut back extensively, both at the local authority level and at the national Westminster level. And the new Labour government has announced that it wants to streamline planning guidance to encourage more housing construction across the entire country. And there will be less money for archaeology, and such money as there is for archaeology will continue to get ploughed into the periods before the post-medieval. So it's becoming a self-reinforcing loop where the later material culture of the late post-medieval period is becoming less and less of a focus of much commercial archaeology, and there's only a few isolated centers of academic archaeology where the 19th century is considered in any way valuable. So the short answer to your question, Susan, is I haven't a clue, except that those of us who are interested in the period have to encourage the analysis where we can. Sorry, that was a very long-winded answer.
Thank you, Alasdair, very much for the talk. I'm just going back to that preferencing where you're looking at the different preferences in the export markets within South America, the North America, Africa and Australia, and how you've aligned at the moment, due to the lack of data in the UK, clearly, as similes between Australasia and the UK. I'm wondering whether that is also reflecting social movements and social settlements as well. Because if you actually think of the period of time when British ceramics are seriously dominating Australasia, is when we massively expand our population almost overnight by two-thirds. Whereas if you're looking at South America, it's a very long history of settlement since the Spanish period. Its ethnic population is being dominated very much by Spain. And then in Americas, they've been settled much longer than Australia. So you're going to have an internal cultural population, a vast population born there with their own characteristics and their own heritage. And that might also reflect different tastes and changes of where material culture is coming from. A comment.
There are several answers to that, and again, I'm going to try and fail to be as succinct as possible. First of all, in terms of the shared cultural affinities between the United Kingdom in the 19th century and Australia, I think you're absolutely right that the explosive growth in population in Australia, much, not all, but much of which is population growth coming from the United Kingdom, yes, that absolutely explains the shared cultural affinities, notwithstanding that there are different identities within the different groups of British settlers within Australia. Yes, I also think it's right that the very different histories of European settlement likely inform differences of consumption in other parts of the world, with some buts. And there are always buts. The first but is if you're working on a South American assemblage, with the exception somewhat of Buenos Aires and its status as a contraband center, and there were British ceramics coming in earlier, it's like night and day between pre-independence and post-independence. And I saw that really, really starkly in Venezuela in 2010, and the main assemblage I was working on there was from a house associated with a prominent political family who provided 3 19th century presidents of Venezuela, 2 brothers, 1 son/nephew, and I think the brothers may even have launched a coup against each other at one point, of the Venezuelan history being what it was. But the division between pre-independence and post-independence in the ceramics was just absolutely extraordinary. Pre-independence is almost nothing but Spanish ceramics. Post-independence, with the exception of Spanish olive oil jars, it's almost nothing but British ceramics. And I haven't had the time to develop this thought, but one of the major considerations here is the extent to which the South American political elites in that time period, immediately before and after independence, were deeply tied into European cultural networks and were acutely conscious of what goods were becoming fashionable in Europe. And people like Bernardo O'Higgins, whom I mentioned, but also Simón Bolívar, Francisco de Miranda, and many of the other libertadores, the leaders of the South American independence movement, spent a huge amount of time in London trying to build support for South American independence. And I know it's difficult to place too much emphasis on a cluster of individuals, but at the same time they were actively writing letters to the British government in this time period saying, if you support our independence movement, we will open you up to British trade. And you just see that happening. And Canning, who was a foreign minister at the time, and up until very recently held the record for shortest term in office for a British prime minister, though at least he had the decency of dying of a heart attack in office, so he had an excuse for his 110 days. But he was a hugely consequential foreign minister who directly supported the independence of South America in exchange for opening it up to British trade. There's a famous quote that I won't be able to get right off the top of my head about how we have helped to make South America free, and if we play our hand correctly, we can make her ours. So, yet there's a different settler context, but there's also this push-pull factor of engagement between the emerging South American elites who are very well aware of fashionable goods back in Europe and the British desire to engage that. And we do see some major British companies directly exporting to South America, sometimes before they export to North America. So Davenport, for example, builds its South American trade before it builds its North American trade. The second but, that was only the first but, you're sorry you asked now, aren't you? But the second part is we still have an incomplete understanding of the push and pull factors between the extent to which it's British ceramics merchants pushing their goods to South America and the extent, building on what I was just saying, South Americans were deliberately inviting in the goods because they wanted to engage with the most fashionable goods as they were considered in the time period. And there's a fantastic diary of a British merchant marine captain of his voyage to Peru while the wars of independence were still taking place, where he's going to some inland village and all of the ceramics are from Staffordshire, all of the cutlery is from Sheffield, all of the wallpaper is from Dundee. And it's the speed of the penetration of British trade into South America is absolutely extraordinary.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I have done some really rudimentary work tracking British overseas naval bases around the globe. And it always seemed to me that British trade, whilst at times preempted the British naval presence and defence of that trade, there were lots of other times where British trade actually stopped because of wars, etc., to only resume when a British squadron or a British base re-emerged in that region. And I was wondering if any of your ceramics research had indicated that off-on related to a British naval presence.
I can give a very short answer to that one. No, not really. Sorry. The only extent of naval engagement I've directly looked at is the engagement between British sailors and Chile, because the early Chilean Navy was almost entirely crewed by the British, but that's not the same as the Royal Navy.
Really quick question. I used to get lots of reports saying the archaeology is perfectly safe. You can develop the site because it's buried under 2 metres of 19th century ceramics. So that was the standard British archaeological report. I was just going to ask a question about encaustic tiles, because the other aspect of Stoke and that industry is the encaustic tile industry. And when I wander around Sydney and I look at the little sort of encaustic tile pavements in front of Paddington Terraces, I see little pieces of ceramics that I swear I recognise from Moore's detritus. So I wonder if that encaustic tile, which is industry, is doing something similar on a global basis from Stoke as the ceramics you spoke of.
I know that it is, but it hasn't been studied extensively archaeologically. I mean, you've just noted an Australian example. I've seen a couple of examples in North America. And then, if you'll forgive me for going back to Chile, one of our volunteer tour guides at Middleport Pottery has a letter that his grandfather wrote of his expedition to cross the Andes from Argentina to Valparaiso, which was by no means easy in 1906, but in 1906, where he's been sent by Minton to try and sell Minton tiles to Valparaiso in the immediate aftermath of the shattering 1906 earthquake. And he's having to write back to his friends and family in the UK as, while I have been sent here to see if business might have arisen in the wake of the damage, the local communities seem to have more important things on their minds. But short answer, yes. Longer answer would involve saying that we just haven't had the opportunity to look at that from an archaeological perspective. Or at least not in detail.
Last call for someone to ask a question. Okay, looks like you're safe, Alasdair, so could everyone join me in thanking